My name's Mark Rhoads. I am an immigration attorney, and what that means is that what I do for a living is that I work with companies and universities all over the United States, and I help them process work visas, and I help them process permanent resident green cards for international employees. My office is based down in Richmond, about 2 hours south of here, and although I'm based in Richmond, I work with companies all over the United States, companies that have thousands of employees and companies that are very, very small. My office processes thousands of work visas every single year, including thousands of H-1Bs. We also process hundreds and hundreds of permanent resident green cards. And I can tell you, in working with employers all over the United States, I can promise you that when you are out interviewing with a company, the person you're interviewing with will have no idea about how the immigration process works in the United States. They will have no idea how you move from being an international student in F status or J status to getting a work visa and then staying in the United States. And because employers don't understand this process, they will frequently push the resumes of international students to the side. It is absolutely imperative, very important, for you to understand how the process works, so that when you are out talking to an employer, you can help educate the employer about how the process works. How long does it take? What does it cost? What are the employer's obligations to you as an employee? All of these things are mysterious to employers, and to the extent that you can help educate the employer about how the process works, it will help you get a job and remain in the United States. So what I'm going to do over the course of the next hour or so is tell you the path to moving from being an F1 student or a J1 student to getting a work visa and staying in the United States. And if we have time at the end, I may even talk a little bit about permanent resident green card. How many folks in here are F1 students? Okay, anybody on J1s? Okay, one. Anybody previously have an H-1B and now you are F or J? Nobody? Anybody have a permanent resident green card? Because you can just mosey on out of here. You don't need to listen to any of this stuff. Okay, well, with that helpful information, here's one of the things I've also found about employers. Even though employers do not understand how the immigration process works, I can promise you that they do like things that international students bring to the table. And I hear this all the time from employers. They like the fact that you are smart. They like the fact that you are risk takers. You know, you leave your home country, you come to the United States, frequently speaking English as a second language. You come to great schools like GW, and you do really well. You know, employers like those qualities. So don't think that no employer wants to hire you because you're international. That's totally false. The biggest problem that employers have is that they don't understand how the process works. Here is how the process works. It really is not all that complicated. There are lots of sub-rules to this, but here's the process that I see in my law practice that 99% of every single international student will follow. And the process is this. If you are F1, when you graduate, you will want to get something called optional practical training. I call it OPT. Okay? Optional practical training, or OPT, will allow you to stay and work in the United States after graduation for up to 12 months. If you are in a STEM degree program, science, technology, engineering, or math, you can stay and work using optional practical training for up to 29 months. While you are working using your optional practical training, you will want to talk to the employer about sponsoring you for H-1B. H-1B is the most common work visa in the United States. It is available to anybody who has a university degree and who is going to work in a job that requires that kind of degree. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. The most common work visa in the United States, I can promise you, there are many, many categories of work visas. The only one that you're going to want to focus on is going to be H-1B. And we're going to talk a lot more about how the H-1B process works in just a minute. So that's the process if you are F1. You will get optional practical training after you graduate. While you're working using OPT, you'll want your employer to sponsor you for H-1B. If you are J1, the sole J1 here in the audience, you will want to get something called academic training. After you graduate, while you're working using academic training, you will want an H-1B. Yeah.
Can you define academic training?
Academic, since there's just one person, I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time with that, but she and I can talk afterwards. So here's, and let me just, for those of you who may have to leave early, or if you're like me, you just get bored, you start to zone out. Let me tell you about some of the materials that I handed out. And in explaining these materials, I'm also going to explain a little bit about how immigration works in the United States. Because I think it's helpful sometimes to have a little bit of background about how immigration works so that you can truly understand that the H-1B is going to be your only option, and it's very, very important to understand how the H-1B visa works. So, as a basic background about U.S. immigration law, if you are going to be in this country and you are going to be here legally, in a lot of ways you can be here illegally, you know, wander down from Canada or scale the wall there down in Mexico. But if you're going to be here legally, there are basically two ways that you can be here. First is as a permanent resident. A permanent resident is somebody who has a green card, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Second way to be here legally is on a temporary or a non-immigrant visa. Non-immigrant visas are all designated by letter. There are non-immigrant temporary visas that run from the letter A all the way down to the letter V, as in Victor. Every letter of the alphabet has some visa category associated with it. For those of you who are here on F1, you're here in the F category, J here in the J category. As far as permanent residence, I get lots of students who ask me, because you're here right now on a temporary F visa, I get lots of students who ask me, look, can't I just get a green card and stay and work in the United States after I graduate? Heck of a lot easier to find a job if I have a permanent resident green card. No question about that. The problem is that you will never get a permanent resident green card by the time you graduate. Forget about permanent resident green card until after graduation while you are working using H-1B. The reason that you will never have a permanent resident green card by the time you graduate, by the way, before I get into that, what is permanent residence? And people always ask me that as well. Permanent residence means that, you know, you're here in F1 status right now, which is temporary visa status. You're only allowed to go to school when you're in F1. Once you get a permanent resident green card, you can live in the United States for the rest of your life. You can work for any employer without restriction. You can also travel freely in and out of the United States without ever having to go back and get a visa ever again. When you travel using permanent resident green card, you use your passport and that permanent resident green card, you can travel freely in and out. You never have to go back to the U.S. Embassy in your home country and visit that embassy officer who hates you and hates his job and hates his life and hates everything. Travel becomes much easier. Work becomes much easier once you get a permanent resident green card. But as I said, the problem with permanent residence is that it can take a very long time. There are only very limited ways to get a green card. To get a green card, there are basically two ways, two primary ways to get a permanent resident green card. I have summarized those on this green chart and on this yellow chart. The first way to get a permanent resident green card that I will talk about very briefly is based on family relationships. If you have a family member in the United States and that family member is either a U.S. citizen or is a U.S. permanent resident, somebody who has a green card, that family member may be able to sponsor you for a permanent resident green card. I have summarized the family members who are eligible to sponsor you for a green card on this yellow chart. Family-based permanent residence. Not all family members could sponsor you for a green card. The family members who are eligible to sponsor you are parents, spouses, kids. You could also be sponsored if you have a brother or a sister who is a permanent resident, but the waiting periods right now are about 15 years for permanent residence based on a brother or sister who's a citizen, so forget about that. So, parents, spouses, kids could sponsor you for permanent residence if you have a parent, a spouse, or a child who is a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident themselves. And I'll always get some student come up after these things and they'll go, a spouse? A spouse can sponsor me for a permanent resident green card? Absolutely. In fact, marriage to a U.S. citizen is the easiest way to get a permanent resident green card in the United States. I can't promise the rest of your life will be so easy, but it is an easy way to get a permanent resident green card. You can actually get a green card based on marriage to a U.S. citizen in about 6 months. Okay, that's the fastest way to get it. Every other mechanism is going to take years. Or I'll also get students who come up and this is always in a whisper. If I have a child in the United States, that child can sponsor me for a permanent resident green card? Absolutely. Any child born in the United States is automatically a U.S. citizen. A U.S. citizen child can sponsor you as a parent for permanent residence once the kid turns 21 years old. Faster ways to get a green card than raising a kid, adolescence, college tuition. You don't want that. Okay, so I'm not going to spend much time on family relationships, but there are ways to get a green card based on family relationships. If you have questions about that, I'll be around afterwards to answer them. But assuming you don't have a family member who is in the United States who is either a permanent resident or a citizen to sponsor you, the other way to get a green card is based on employment. If you have an employer who is willing to sponsor you for permanent residence. And I'll talk a little bit later about the process for getting permanent residence based on employment. But the bottom line is this. It will take a minimum of 2 to 3 years to get a permanent resident green card. If you are from China or India, it could take 10 years or longer. Okay? It is a long process to get permanent residence based on employment. First thing you have to do is find a job and an employer who will sponsor you. So forget about permanent residence when you are out looking for employment. Rather than thinking about permanent resident green card, focus on the options that are available to you that are temporary work visas. So what you want to look at are the temporary non-immigrant visa categories. And the temporary non-immigrant visa categories, as I said, run from the letter A all the way down to the letter V. Every single letter of the alphabet has some visa category associated with it. Most of them will never apply to you, or you won't want them to apply to you. For example, one of the visa categories, one of my favorites, is the S visa. I call it the snitch visa. It's just for people who are coming to the United States to testify in a criminal trial, and then they have to get out at the end of their testimony. Okay. I hope you never have to have an S visa for anything, but you certainly won't want one to stay and work in the United States. Other visa categories, A visa, for example. The A visa category is just for ambassadors or embassy officials working at foreign embassies in the United States. Well, some of you may want to graduate from GW and go to work for your home country embassy in the US, but not many. So forget about the A visa, forget about the S visa. In fact, forget about most of the visa categories, except for the ones that I have summarized on this blue chart. So what I've taken is the visa categories A to V, and I have pulled out the ones and put on this chart the ones that I actually see in my law practice that employers use to hire international employees in the US. So there's a very handy little cheat sheet of visa options that may be available to you. And the way the chart works is on the left-hand side of the page, it tells about the visa category going down. And then going across the page, it gives information about that visa category. How long can you stay? What kinds of things can you do and not do? How do you qualify? That kind of thing. And when you take this blue chart and you go back to your apartment or your dorm and you start fishing around the internet to learn more about these things, you will find that you will qualify for none of them other than what's up here on the back at the very top, which is F1, then optional practical training, and then H1B. And I will also do lots of talking to employers. I do go to many conferences where employers get together and talk about issues of recruiting on college campuses. And when I talk to them about the H1B and optional practical training, they always say, okay, you make it sound pretty simple. Do you have a little one-page summary of the rules for this? And so I said, okay, I'll come up with one. So I developed my easy guide to hiring foreign graduates. This is a very handy piece of paper. If everything else goes in the trash can at the end of this session, you should hold on to this. I prepared this easy guide to hiring foreign graduates specifically with employers in mind. It is designed to address concerns that employers have about hiring an F1 or a J1 student and the process that comes after graduation. And I say right here at the very top in bold letters, hey, employer, don't let fear of the simple immigration process prevent you from hiring the best and the brightest people out there. There are simple mechanisms to allow you to hire international students. Roman numeral 1, practical training. Roman numeral 2, H-1B. And on this piece of paper, I tell the employer things like, how much does it cost? How long does it take to get the practical training? How long does it take to get H-1B? What are the employer's obligations when they want to sponsor you for H-1B? All employers want to know these things. So this is a very handy summary. If you're talking to an employer and the employer has questions about how you move from being F to working after graduation, slide it across the table. Make copies of this, as many as you want. And when the employer gets it, and I can tell you that over the years, I've been doing this for about 20 years, and I have helped hundreds and hundreds of international students get jobs with employers who had never done an H-1B ever before, because they had this piece of paper and they gave it to the employer. And to me, some of the most helpful information is right down here at the very bottom, which is my contact information, my email, my telephone. And the reason that's helpful is because I will answer questions for free. If you're talking to an employer and that employer has questions about the process, tell them to give me a call or send me an email. If you are out talking to employers and you have forgotten everything that we talk about here this evening, give me a call, send me an email. And I'm happy to remind you of some of the rules. And I promise you, I answer hundreds of questions from employers every single year. And many employers who have never done an H-1B before are willing to go forward, usually after about a 5-minute conversation. So this can be a very helpful piece of paper, a very useful tool. I encourage you to hold on to this and to use it. All right, the last thing that I handed out, H-1B is the most common work visa in the United States, but there is a limit on the number of H-1Bs that the government can issue every single year. We're going to talk more about that. The H-1B quota. The quota is 85,000. Every single year they have 85,000 H-1Bs that they can issue, and every single year they run out. If they run out of H-1Bs, you'll want to know if there are other options available to you. I have summarized those options on that blue chart. There aren't very many options available. This summary is a little more detailed discussion of some of the visa options that are on that blue chart. Because if you are not selected in the H-1B quota, you have some real issues that you're going to have to address about the type of visa that will allow you to stay in the United States. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those later, but you will find that your options are practically zero. All right, with that helpful and depressing introduction, let me talk a little bit about optional practical training. As I said, if you are F1, after you graduate, you will want to get optional practical training, OPT. Anybody here in a STEM program, science, technology, engineering, math? A couple people? Okay. So if you are not in a STEM program, you will get 12 months of OPT. If you're in a STEM program, you can extend that for an additional 17 months in certain circumstances that I'll talk about in a second. Here are some very important rules with regard to optional practical training, and I cannot encourage you enough to go to any training programs that they put on at this university to explain the optional practical training process. You must go to training programs and understand how the OPT works, because you will absolutely want to get optional practical training. Okay? First, most important rule is that even though all F1 students are eligible for optional practical training, which will allow you, by the way, to work after graduation for any employer doing any job anywhere in the United States. as long as that job relates to your degree. So getting OPT is absolutely the best way to get your foot in the door with an employer. An employer doesn't have to do anything. They don't have to file any forms with the government. They don't have to pay any filing fees. You are eligible to work for any employer anywhere in the country as long as the job is related to your degree, but you must, in order to work, get yourself a work card. It's called an employment authorization document. It is your optional practical training employment authorization document, your OPT-EAD. You cannot work until you have that card in your hands. If you work before you have the card, you are deportable from the United States. If an employer puts you to work before you have the card, that employer will be subject to fines and penalties from the government. No employer wants to take that risk. So, in order to work after graduation, the smartest thing you can do is to get yourself that optional practical training employment authorization document. How do you get that document? It's actually it's a card. It looks just like a driver's license. There is a window to apply for that card, and that window is 90 days before graduation or up to 60 days after graduation. That's the window. You can't apply any earlier than 90 days before graduation. You can't apply later than 60 days after graduation. Now, right now, it is taking, and an important thing, you don't have to have a job offer to apply for that card. You're automatically eligible to get the card just because you're an F1 student. You don't even have to have started looking for a job yet in order to qualify for that card. For J1 academic training, you don't need this card, so you can kind of do this for the next couple of minutes and not have to listen to any of it. So to get that card, and right now, the Immigration Service, by the way, is taking 90 to 120 days to process the card. In other words, from the time you put your application in for the card, there's a form you have to fill out, there's a filing fee, $380 filing fee. You have to submit the form to the Immigration Service from the time that you submit that form. You can't submit it any earlier than 90 days before graduation. You can't submit it any later than 60 days after graduation. From the time you submit that card, it's taking the Immigration Service 90 to 120 days to process, which means you won't get the card for 90 to 120 days. You can't work without the card. Applying doesn't give you anything. You have to have the card in your hand. So if you want to go to work shortly after graduation, and I'm sure many of you do, you'll have to have that card in your hands. If it's taking the Immigration Service 90 days to process it, why wait? Why delay? My view is find your graduation date on a calendar and count back 90 days. File the application then. It's the earliest you can file. It's taken the Immigration Service 90 days to process it. That way it'll be in your hands by the time you graduate. What could be better than that? And I'll get students all the time who'll say, well, I was busy, studying for exams, keg party, blah, blah, blah. Didn't get a chance to apply until 2 days after graduation. And I get these calls every year. It breaks my heart. Student calls up and says, you know what? I got my dream job, $100,000 starting salary, BMW in the parking lot with my name on the license plate, but I've got to start tomorrow. And I tell them, great. Do you have your optional practical training work card, the EAD? Yeah, I didn't get around to applying for that until yesterday. The employer wants me to start right away. Is that going to be a problem? Yes, major problem. You cannot work without the card. That employer is going to push your job offer aside and give that to somebody else because you didn't have the card and you weren't ready to work. And it happens, I can tell you, every single year that people delay and they lose job opportunities because they don't have that card in their hand. Now, $380 is money. I mean, it's real money to apply for the card. And I will have students who will say, I have an employer who is, actually better yet, I have students who come in and they'll say, look, I'm getting married to a U.S. citizen after graduation, so I really don't need to apply for that work card because once I get married, I'm going to apply for a green card, no problem there. Guess what? Your fiance is going to be walking across M Street, hit by a bus, and killed. You will have nothing if you didn't apply for that work card. Or some other student, they'll say, well, my uncle has a company, he's going to sponsor me for H-1B, so I really don't need to have that work card because I'm going to get an H-1B right after graduation. Guess what? Your uncle is going to be walking with that fiance right across the street, hit by the same bus, and killed, and you will have nothing if you don't get the card. Or students who say, I'm going to go back to my home country, I'm not going to stay in the United States, but guess what? Your country devolves into revolution, or some terrible thing happens, you don't want to go home. The point is, no matter what you think your plans may be, the one way that can assure that you can stay in the United States if everything else goes wrong is to get that work card. It is the best $380 you will ever spend. I cannot encourage you enough to apply for the card, apply early, and be ready to work after graduation. Now, you can work for 12 months. Oh, here's a very important point that I almost overlooked, and that is, once you get the card in your hands and the card is effective, you only have 90 days of unemployment time. Remember, you don't have to have a job to apply for the card. Don't even have to start looking for a job to apply for the card. When you apply for the card, you will say on the application form when you want that card to be effective. Effective means when does it actually start? And they'll put an effective date right on the card. You can make the card effective anytime within 60 days after your graduation. So when is graduation? You're like May 15, May 15. Graduation day is May 15. Circle it on your calendar, count back 90 days, apply for the card. You can then ask it to be effective anytime within the 60 days after graduation. Well, so let's say you want to congratulate yourselves for all of your hard work here at GW, and you want to give yourself 30 days off to lay around on the beach all day long. Fine. You can delay the effective date until, May 5th, June 15, 30 days after graduation. You make the card effective. So you apply 90 days in advance, takes the Immigration Service 90 days to issue it. You have it in your hands on May 15, graduation day. But you asked for it to be effective 30 days later. Perfectly fine, but you can't work until the card is effective. So June 15, that card is effective. Also, June 15 starts your unemployment clock. In other words, whenever you make that card effective is when the unemployment clock starts. And starting from that day, you have 90 days to find a job. If 30 days goes by and you haven't found employment yet, you better start sweating and hurrying to find a position. 60 days go by, you really better start sweating, because at the end of 90 days, if you do not have a job, your work authorization automatically expires. I don't know if the card actually disappears or what, but your work authorization expires and you are then deportable from the United States. You'll have to leave the US. So that 90-day clock is very important. But assuming you have the card in your hand after you graduate and you find a job within that 90 days, you can work for up to 12 months. If you are in a STEM degree program, you can get an extension of that optional practical training for an additional 17 months for a total of 29 months. But don't count on that extension if you are in a STEM degree program. It is not automatic. You only get that additional 17 months if you are working for an employer who is enrolled in something called E-Verify. Okay? The employer must be enrolled in the government's E-Verify program. E-Verify is this program that allows an employer to submit documents electronically to the government to prove that their entire workforce is employment authorized in the United States. It is a very intrusive program by the government. It is a very expensive program for companies to administer. Most companies in the United States, the vast majority of companies, are not enrolled in E-Verify. It is a voluntary program right now. Most employers are not enrolled. So even if you are eligible for the STEM extension, you may not get it because you're not working for an employer enrolled in the E-Verify program. If you are working for an employer and you want to get the STEM extension and the employer is not enrolled and they want to talk about how to get enrolled, tell them to contact me. I'm happy to talk to them about it. Chances are after I tell them about it, they're not going to want to enroll, but you never know, okay? Okay. So, Assuming you've listened to this advice and you've applied for your card and you have the card in your hand and you're ready to go to work, you work for the employer. While you're working for the employer, you know that you have a clock ticking, 12 months. And at the end of that 12 months, your work authorization will expire. If you have the STEM degree, you can get the additional 17, maybe not. But there's that 12-month clock that's ticking. At the end of 12 months, you can stay in the United States for an additional 60 days, but you can't work during that 60 days. So you have 12 months of work authorization. When your work card expires, you can no longer work unless you have changed your status to some other work authorized visa. The most common is the H-1B. So let's talk about the H-1B and some of the rules and the problems associated with H-1B. First, most importantly, is that the OPT work card, you can apply for that. You pay the $380 filing fee. The employer doesn't have to do anything. Not so with H-1B. H-1B, only an employer can submit an H-1B application. You cannot file on your own. You must have an employer. So you have to have an employer who's willing to sponsor you. There are two requirements to qualify for H-1B. Requirement number one, you must have a degree, you being the applicant. You have to have a university degree. If you are in an undergraduate program, you cannot file until you have your degree. If you are in a master's program or an advanced degree program, guess what? You already have a degree. You have your undergraduate degree that can qualify you for H-1B. You don't have to wait to get your advanced degree in order to qualify for H-1B if you choose. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So the requirement number one is that you must have a degree. That degree can be from the United States, a U.S. institution, or it can be a degree from outside the United States, as long as the degree is the equivalent of a U.S. degree. Lots of Indian degrees are 3-year degrees. It has to be a 4-year degree to be equivalent of a U.S. degree. So requirement number one is you got to have a degree. Requirement number two is that the degree has to relate to the job that you're being offered. In other words, the job that you're going to do must require the kind of degree that you have. So for example, if you are graduating with a degree in accounting and you get a job with an accounting firm as an accountant, that is a great H-1B. Because you have a degree, the job, accountant, requires a degree, and it requires the kind of degree that you have. But let's say you graduate with a degree in accounting and you decide, I hate accounting, but I love art, and I want to be a museum curator. All right, well, you have a degree. The job of museum curator requires a degree, but it doesn't require the kind of degree that you have. So no H-1B for you. The point being that when you are out looking for jobs, make sure that you are focusing your efforts in fields that require the kind of degree that you have in order to do them. Don't decide in the last semester of your degree program that you really haven't liked what you're doing and you want to branch off afterwards into something else, because you will not qualify for H-1B. Yes?
So what is the degree for undergrad is different than the master's degree? So it will be the most recent degree that you are requiring?
If you have an undergraduate degree that is in a field that's different from your advanced degree, you can qualify for H-1B using either one. So if you have a degree in art history as a bachelor's degree and you want to get and you're right now in an MBA program, well, you get a museum curator because you have that undergraduate degree, no problem. You can definitely qualify for H-1B. Now, I get a question a lot, who makes the determination about whether or not my degree relates to the job? Well, ultimately, it's the Immigration Service, because we'll file an application with the Immigration Service giving information about your degree and giving information about the job duties, and the Immigration Service will decide whether or not these duties require the kind of degree that you have. But before we file the application, I will first make a determination as to whether I think your degree relates to the job, because I'm not going to waste your time or your money filing an application that I do not think will be approved. Our office probably has processed 20,000 H-1Bs over the years. We've had less than a handful of denials because we are very rigorous in our evaluation of whether or not your degree relates to the job. I mean, if somebody called me up and they said, I have a degree in accounting and I want to get a job as a museum curator, the first thing I would say is, probably not going to work. Now, doesn't mean that it's totally out of the question. I could probably make a pretty reasonable argument that a museum curator job requires an accounting degree much more than it requires an art degree. As a museum curator, you're worried about the financial aspects of running the museum, of acquiring art, that kind of thing. You can hire anybody to point out pretty pictures to you. That's the art history person. I need a business degree to do that. So you could probably make a pretty good case, but there's no guarantee that it would be approved. Those are the kind of more difficult H-1B cases. The point is that if you have a degree, look for jobs that are going to almost certainly require the kind of degree you have to increase your chances of getting an H-1B. So those are the two requirements. You have to have a degree. Job has to require the kind of degree that you have. I will get employers. When I say that, I get employers all the time who say, aha, that is wrong, because I read on the internet, the greatest source of misinformation known to man. I read on the internet that I have to advertise first to find a U.S. worker before I can hire an H-1B worker, and I can only hire the H-1B if there are no qualified U.S. workers. Wrong. Totally wrong. The employer does not have to advertise at all. No need to advertise to find U.S. workers, and I explain that on that easy guide to hiring foreign graduates. There is no requirement that the employer advertise to find a U.S. worker. Yes?
So if I have a 3-year undergraduate degree and now I'm requiring a master's degree,
You will qualify. Yes, you will. The question was, if I have a 3-year undergraduate degree and now I'm getting a master's degree, can I qualify for H-1B? And the answer is yes, you can qualify either based on the master's degree, or it's possible that we could combine the undergraduate degree and some of your master's level education to get the equivalent of a bachelor's degree. Yes?
just along the lines of educating the employer, what's the basis for their belief that they need to advertise and that there has to be no U.S. workers? Is that like old law and now it's changed?
I don't know. The question is, why are employers confused about this? Where do they get the information they have to advertise? I have no idea. Fox News, I can't tell you. I mean, it is a pervasive myth. Once you get to the green card process, when the employer wants to sponsor for permanent residence, there is an advertising requirement, but there is absolutely not for the H-1B.
Is there a source that you would talk to the employer that you can refer them to?
Yeah, if you go to your easy, the question is there a source that you can refer to the employer to? If you go to this easy guide to hiring foreign graduates, right down here at the bottom is my contact information, and I'm happy to share. I mean, there isn't a law or statute that says no advertising is required. It would only be a law if it said it was required, and it would be hard to point them to a negative. Yes?
Just working for a top-notch company increases chances of H-1B as against keep from trying to sponsor.
Yeah, the question is, and this gets into the quota a little bit, the question is, does working for a top-notch firm increase your chances of getting an H-1B? No, it does not. And in fact, let me point out one thing about looking for employment using H-1B, because I get many students who express frustration saying that they can't find an employer who will sponsor them for H-1B. Because I can tell you that many of the top employers, the largest companies, large banks, large consulting companies, they do not sponsor H-1B because they can get plenty of U.S. candidates. I can tell you from experience that the employers who really are going to be willing to sponsor H-1B tend to be smaller to medium-sized employers. Employers that have maybe 200, 250 employees or fewer. The reason for that is they are hungry for the kind of talent that you have. They want top students, but the top U.S. students tend to go to the bigger firms. So the smaller to mid-sized companies really want it, and they are willing to hire H-1B. Now let me tell you, the quota is 85,000 H-1Bs every year. And every single year, all of them are taken. The good news about that is that there are tens of thousands of employers who will sponsor H-1B. I can promise you that. So don't just focus your job search on the largest employers, because you will be frustrated. You're not going to be able to do what some of your U.S. citizen friends do in terms of looking for a job. You know, they roll out of bed, put on a tie, go to the career day here on campus. You may have to go outside of campus. It may take you a little more work to broaden your search, but you will find companies who will sponsor, I promise. And it does not help you, it doesn't increase your chances of getting an H-1B to work for a large employer. I've had many H-1Bs for companies that have 1 or 2 employees. And statistically, about 85% of the H-1Bs that are issued every single year, 85% are for companies that only have 1 to 2 H-1B workers. It's not all Microsoft. It's not all Google. It is smaller to mid-sized employers who use the majority of the H-1Bs. Okay, a couple of tidbit rules about H-1B. Once you find an employer, and the employer is willing to sponsor you, the employer submits an application to the Immigration Service. The Immigration Service takes about 5 months to process an H-1B application. So you will want that H-1B to be effective by the time your OPT work card expires, so that you can move right from OPT right into H-1B. You don't have to depart the United States to become H-1B. It happens by magic. Prang, on the day that the H-1B is effective, you're automatically H-1B. You don't have to leave. The next time you do travel, you'll need a new visa to come back in, but if you never leave the United States, you can move right from being F1 using optional practical training to H-1B without departing. When the H-1B is approved, it will be approved initially for 3 years, and you can get a 3-year extension for a total of 6 years in H-1B status. During that 6 years is when you will want to start thinking about a permanent resident green card, if that's your goal. So, 3 years initially, 3-year extension, total of 6 years. When you get H-1B, when you have an employer who files the H-1B application and sponsors you for H-1B, you can only work for that employer. You can't work for anybody else. You can't work for yourself on weekends. You can't do stock trading at night unless it's your own stocks, on your own, freelance. You can only work for the employer who sponsors you. And you can only work the job described in that H-1B application. Well, what happens if you decide you want to leave? Now, let's say you go to work after graduation for employer A. Employer A files an H-1B application, and they can file for 3 years initially. Let's say a year into it, you hate employer A, and you decide you want to go to work for employer B. You can do that, but employer B will have to file a new H-1B application for you. Why is that? Because you're moving to a new job, and the Immigration Service is going to want to know whether or not the new job requires the kind of degree that you have. So every time you change employers, you have to file a new H-1B application. But you will, no matter how many employers you work for, you only get a total of 6 years in H-1B status. So if you go to work for employer A, they get a 3-year H-1B. 1 year into it, you leave and go to employer B. Employer B files an H-1B application. They will get 3 years. That'll be a total of 4 years. 1 year with employer A, 3 years with employer B. You will then have an opportunity to get a 2-year extension for a total of 6 years. That's all you get. Yeah. What will happen is a question about the interplay between a visa and your status. A visa is a travel document. Your status is different. You are right now F1 status in the United States. You entered using an F1 visa. They gave you an I-94 card that granted you F1 status in the US. While you are here, if you change to H-1B, you can change right here in the United States. You can change your status from F1 to H-1B. But the visa in your passport is an F1 visa. It may even expire. That's fine as long as your status is, your I-20 governs your status as long as you're an F1 student. You apply to change your status to H-1B. That's fine. You can stay and work. But then the next time you travel out of the US, you're going to want to come back in H-1B status. The only way to do that is to get an H-1B visa. So you'll have to go back to the US Embassy and apply for the visa right there. It is much easier to get an H-1B than it is to get an F1. H-1B is about the easiest type of visa to apply for, so you can't say never have problems, but you will not have any of the difficulty you had when you got F1 when you were traveling using H-1B. So once you re-enter, you'll have an H-1B visa. They'll give you a new I-94 card showing your new status as an H-1B employee. Okay, couple of major issues. Issue number one, the cost of the H-1B. Remember, when you got optional practical training, you paid for that card, $380. When you get H-1B, it's very different. There are many, many costs associated with the H-1B. There are two basic categories of costs for the H-1B. The first category of cost is legal fee, an attorney fee, my fee. Most companies do not have an attorney or don't have anybody in-house that can sponsor or prepare the H-1B application. It's a very complicated process. So most of the time, the employer is going to say, go find an attorney, or the employer may have their own attorney. So there's going to be an attorney fee associated with the H-1B. In my office, we charge $2,100, $2,100 to process an H-1B application. Then there are government filing fees, the CIS filing fees. CIS is the Citizenship and Immigration Services. So when you file an H-1B application with the Immigration Service, there are a bunch of filing fees. The filing fees are listed up here. Every time Congress gets together, it seems like they throw another filing fee on the H-1B program. As it stands right now, the filing fees are the following. If you go to work for an employer that has 25 or fewer employees, the filing fee is $1,575. If you go to work for an employer with more than 25 employees, the filing fee is $2,325. So those are the filing fees. So if you look at, and you have to add all these things up, and there are some other fees thrown in that don't apply most of the time, but the total is going to be for 25 or fewer, $1,575. If you have more than 25, it's going to be $2,325. So if you add the two together, the lawyer fee, $2,100, and let's say you go to work for an employer with more than 25 employees, the filing fee, $2,325, you're looking at around $4,400 to file for an H-1B. And I tell students that, they always go, who's ever going to take $4,400 and flush it down the toilet to hire me? And the answer to that is, if you go into an interview with that attitude, you'll never find a job. You have to be able to explain to the employer that these costs aren't intimidating. And they aren't intimidating because they are nothing more than a recruiting expense, just like any other recruiting expense they have. When an employer is trying to fill a position, they always have expenses associated with that. They're running ads in newspapers. They're sending recruiters to college campuses. They're spending time interviewing candidates. All of that has a cost to it. And I will get employers who will call me up and they'll say, I have this great international candidate. I'm looking at this easy guide of hiring foreign graduates, so I gave you a call. And I tell them, filing fee, lawyer fee, $2,100, filing fee, $2,325. They go, whoa, I'm not going to pay all that. It's okay. That's an economic decision for the employer to make. All right, employer, you have an excellent candidate that you want to hire sitting right in front of you. And you're going to have that person walk out the door because of $4,400. I promise you that in the next 2 weeks, you will spend more than $4,400 trying to put another person in that chair to interview. Because you're going to be running ads, you're going to be running around recruiting, you're going to be interviewing people. And when you explain that to employers, they almost always go, I never thought of it that way. I never thought of it as a recruiting expense, and you know what? It makes sense. So don't be afraid of those costs. Again, 85,000 H-1Bs can be issued every year. All 85,000 are taken. Employers are not afraid of those costs. You should not be afraid of those costs either. But the next question is, who pays? Who has to pay those fees? Well, the government's view is that the employer is supposed to pay all the fees and costs of the H-1B program. All fees and costs are supposed to be paid by the employer. Now, some employers are willing to do that, and frankly, in my experience, most employers are willing to pay those fees and costs. Some employers are not. Some employers will say, well, we'll split it. You pay the legal fee, I'll pay the filing fee, something like that. Small percentage of employers will do that. If you have an employer who says that they want you to pay some or all of those fees, the lawyer fee and the filing fee, I can tell you that if the government audits that employer, the government will make the employer pay you back. And they have lots of auditors that swarm out across the country auditing H-1B employers. And the first question on their little checklist of questions that they ask is, who paid the legal fee and filing fee for the H-1B? And if the employer made you pay any part of it, the government will make the employer pay you back, and in some cases can fine the employer $1,000. So it is supposed to be an employer fee. Now, if you have an employer who's willing to sponsor you for H-1B, and they say, I'm only going to do it if you pay, well, is it a violation of your status if you pay? It is not. So if you can only find a job with an employer who wants to make you pay the H-1B fees and costs, it's no harm to your status if you do that. So when we start talking about the quota in 2 seconds, you will find that you should get that H-1B through an employer even if they want you to pay the fees and costs. And then if you decide later to change and go to another employer, you can call the Immigration Service and say, hey, well, can I get my money back? I'm not recommending that. Okay, here's a very important issue, the H-1B quota. As I said, the quota is 85,000. The quota is released every year on October 1st. And the quota year runs from October 1 to September 30 every single year. So right now we're a little over halfway into the quota year. The quota year started October 1 of 2013, and it runs until September 30 of 2014. During the quota, the Immigration Service can issue 85,000 H-1Bs. That 85,000 quota is divided into two different buckets. There is a bucket of 20,000 that is available to anybody with a United States advanced degree, an advanced degree from a U.S. university. Then there is a quota of 65,000 that is for everybody else with a degree, no matter where it's from. So if you have a master's degree from Canada, you're in the 65,000 quota because that's not a U.S. advanced degree. If you have a bachelor's degree from China, you're in the 65,000 quota. If you have a master's degree from George Washington University, you're in the 20,000 quota because that's a U.S. advanced degree. Well, what difference does it make which of these quotas you fall into? It doesn't make any difference. The H-1B is exactly the same. The only difference is that the quota used to be 65,000. Congress noted that that was running out too quickly. They wanted to encourage international students to get advanced degrees, and so they came up with this second quota of 20,000 for U.S. advanced degree holders, because they figured it would last longer and it would encourage international students to come to the United States. Well, as with so many ideas that Congress has, they were wrong. And in fact, this quota runs out very, very quickly. So does that mean that if you have a U.S. advanced degree that somehow you get ripped off? No. If you have a U.S. advanced degree, you are first in this quota, and if that runs out, you automatically drop down to that quota. So you actually get 2 bites of the apple if you have a U.S. advanced degree. Well, the quota year started October 1, ends September 30, 2014. 85,000 H-1Bs were released on October 1. Anybody have any idea how many are left right now? 0. In fact, on October 1, 2013, all 85,000 had already been taken. And they had already been taken because of pre-filings. In other words, you can file in advance of October 1 to get one of those quota numbers. You must understand the pre-filing process. And here it is in picture format. The quota year starts October 1. Employers can file for H-1B up to 6 months in advance. April 1, ironically, April Fool's Day, every year is when employers start filing for H-1B, which means it's about, 26 days from now is when the Immigration Service will start accepting H-1B applications for the October 1 quota. And I can tell you that in my office right now, we're churning out H-1B applications like crazy, stacking them up to the ceiling in FedEx packages to be sent to the Immigration Service on March 31st for receipt by the Immigration Service on April 1. You cannot file earlier than April 1 because they will reject your application as being filed too early. It must get there on April 1. And on April 1, the Immigration Service will receive far more than 85,000 H-1B applications. Last year, they received 129,000 applications. This year, almost certainly, they will receive more than 150,000 applications for 85,000 quota numbers. Congress refuses to increase this quota. So I will not comment further on that, other than to say the only way that you can get yourself into the game is to file your application on April 1. If you file on April 2, it's too late because all the quota numbers will be taken on April 1. Okay? So here's what happens. They get, let's say that, there are 2 service centers in the United States that process H-1B applications. There's one service center out in California, one service center up in Vermont. And on April 1, the skies over those service centers will blacken with FedEx planes swooping down to dump tens of thousands of H-1B applications on each of those service centers. They will then take all the H-1Bs, they'll put them in a big pile, 150,000 of them. They'll start with the master's degree folks, and they'll count out 20,000 U.S. advanced degree cases, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 20,000. Then they'll take all the rest of the master's degree folks and dump them into the other pile, and they will count out 65,000. Once they've done the 20,000 and the 65,000, they will return the uncounted applications to the sender. And if you get one of those brown envelopes back from the Immigration Service, it is a sad day because you know that your case was not selected in the quota, which means you will have almost no options to stay in the United States after your OPT expires. So you must get your application in on April 1, and when you are talking to employers after you get your job using OPT, you'll have to make sure the employer understands that. So here's how it works very quickly. April 1 is when they'll start accepting applications. All right, on April 1, they're all going to be gone. You graduate here in May, right? May 15. You will get optional practical training that will be good for 12 months. Takes you up to here. Well, you start working using your optional practical training because the H-1B quota has already been taken on April 1. All of them are gone. So you start working using OPT, and you start work. You get up here to October 1 when the quota is released. You don't care because the quota's already gone and nobody sponsored you for H-1B anyway. You worked and you work and you work and you work. You start looking at this April 1, the April 1 after you graduate. So you're working for the employer and work. You get up here into January or February, and you say to the employer, my OPT expires in May. I must get an H-1B. It has to be filed on April 1. And the employer says, fine, contacts me. We get the H-1B application together. We file the H-1B application on March 31st. It is received on April 1. Immigration Service does this lottery thing, and your case is selected. Yeehaw. Immigration Service right now is taking about 5 months to process an H-1B. So they accept it on April 1, May, June, July, August, September 1, you get your approval notice saying that you have been approved for H-1B. Does that mean you're now H-1B? No, because the quota is not released until October 1. So even though you filed April 1, it's going to be approved right around here, but it is not effective until October 1. But we have a problem. Your OPT, which started here, expired here. Well, It used to be a real problem because at the end of your optional practical training, it used to be that your employment authorization ended and the Immigration Service said, get out of the country. Not so anymore. That gap, by the way, between when your OPT expires and when the H-1B becomes effective on October 1, that is called the cap gap. It is a gap in your employment authorization caused by the H-1B cap. Well, the Immigration Service woke up in a good mood one day and said, you know, that's kind of a stupid rule to make students leave the United States and disrupt employers and all that kind of stuff. So the rule now is that as long as you file an H-1B application on, well, this is an old slide. It says on or after April 1. You want to file it on April 1. And as long as your OPT has not yet expired, then your OPT will automatically extend until October 1 when the H-1B quota is released. That's called cap gap relief. Sounds like an antacid. Probably is. So you have OPT that starts here and it ends here. As long as you file an H-1B right here, then your OPT will automatically extend until October 1 when the quota is released. So you will have uninterrupted work authorization. All right, so what happens, however, if you don't get in the quota? What happens if you get one of those terrible envelopes back from the Immigration Service? They will return your filing fees and they return the entire H-1B application. What do you do then? Well, you don't have a lot of options. There are certain organizations that are exempt from the quota, so you could run around and try to find a job with an organization that is exempt from the quota. Being exempt means that the employer doesn't care about the quota. Certain organizations can file an H-1B anytime. There is no quota for these organizations, universities being the primary organization. If you go to work at a university, that university can file an H-1B anytime, regardless of whether the quota has run out for everybody else. And that doesn't mean you have to be a professor. You could go to, if you have a business degree, you go to work at a business office at the university, you can get an H-1B anytime. Second, nonprofit organizations affiliated with universities. If you get a job with a nonprofit that is affiliated with a university, like a university-affiliated hospital or a university-affiliated research center, you can get an H-1B anytime, regardless of the quota. Next, nonprofit research organizations that are engaged primarily in basic or applied research. Lots of people think that all nonprofits are exempt from the quota. Not so. The Red Cross is a nonprofit, but it is not a research organization. It actually does things. So the Red Cross is subject to the H-1B quota. Certain nonprofit research organizations are not. It can be scientific research, it can be social science research, it can be tax policy research. A lot of think tanks will be exempt from the H-1B quota as long as they do basic or applied research. Last, certain governmental research organizations like the Los Alamos National Lab or the Jefferson National Lab down in Newport News. So those are the only exempt organizations. So if you're not selected in the quota, you can get a job with one of these organizations. They can file H-1B anytime. Well, let's say you don't get a job with one of these exempt organizations. What other options do you have? Not many. Let me blow through them really quickly. First, if you are from one of these 5 countries, I call them the magical 5. If you're from Canada, Mexico, Chile, Singapore, or Australia, there are excellent visa options available other than the H-1B. There are quotas on some of these, but the quotas never, ever run out. Anybody here from one of those countries? That's why the quotas never, ever run out. One person, more than I usually see. So if you're from one of those countries, there are excellent options that are available. Happy to talk to you afterwards. Next category, if you're not from one of the magical 5, L1. If you're in business school, this could be a very helpful thing. L1 is for individuals working for multinational companies. It doesn't have to be a giant company. As long as the company has operations outside the United States and operations inside the United States, you may qualify for L1. But you first must work for the company outside the US for at least 1 year. And then you can transfer in using L1. I've done that for very large companies, and I've done it for companies that have fewer than 10 employees, as long as they have some employees outside and some inside. Well, if you're not going to work for a multinational company, you may qualify for an e-visa. An e-visa is available to citizens of certain countries that have treaties of trade and commerce with the United States. If you are from a country that has a treaty of trade or commerce with the United States, you can get a job in the US with a company that is owned by citizens of your country. So, for example, France is a treaty country. If you're a French citizen and you get a job with a French-owned company in the United States, you may be able to qualify for an e-visa. What countries are on these treaties? Well, on the back of my H-1B exemptions and alternatives, I have listed the countries that have treaties of trade and commerce with the United States. China, forget it. India, forget it. You're not on the list. But if you are from one of the countries listed on the back of this sheet, and you find a job in the United States with a company owned by citizens of your country, you may qualify for an e-visa. That is obviously a very limited option. However, if you are from a treaty country, that is an opportunity for you, if you are an entrepreneur, to start your own business. If you would like to start your own business, you can start your own business using the e-visa category. And I've done many, many e-visas for small startup companies. Next, if you are not from one of the magical 5, you're not working for a multinational company, you're not from a treaty country, or if you are, you can't find a job with a company owned by citizens of your country, then your next option is re-enroll in school. Because other than that, you don't have any options. Okay? That's why it is so important to understand the H-1B and to make sure you get your H-1B application in on April 1 to give yourself the best chance of getting that H-1B. All right, permanent residence is beyond the scope of this discussion. I'll be happy to come back at another point and talk more about permanent residence. But the point of permanent residence is that it will take a long time. And for most students, you must first get the H-1B, and then you can start thinking about permanent residence while you're working using your H-1B. Okay? One last note on choosing an attorney. As I said, many companies, most companies, do not have in-house expertise to process an H-1B. So when you are out talking to companies, and if the company says, look, just go find a lawyer, well, I want to do the H-1B, happy to help you out. Don't just choose the cheapest person you can find in the phone book. You will have one chance to get an H-1B application in, and it must be right. You have to get it in on April 1. It has to have the right filing fees. It has to be filed at the right service center. If your case goes in and it is rejected for any reason, you've lost your one opportunity. So make sure that when you are out looking for an immigration attorney, you choose somebody who knows what they're doing. All right, with that, I'm happy to stick around and answer questions afterwards. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention.